Not only did Chuck Schuldiner start death metal, but he also changed people's perceptions of death in music. Chuck wasn't only a musician, he was a hidden icon, a man who remained authentic in the face of the commercialization and mayhem in the metal industry. His unrivaled guitar skills, philosophical lyricism and unwavering spirit made him more than just that. Millions look up to him as the trailblazer who, in the midst of his own anguish and isolation, created contemporary death metal. In addition to being a personal, symbolic and perseverance-inspiring landmark in extreme music history, the album Scream Bloody Gore is often considered the first bullet that brought death metal into worldwide notice. There was a kind spirit beneath those vicious tunes. He adored animals, valued his family, and had aspirations of being a veterinarian instead of a famous performer. He once called off a performance because the promoter wanted to include a satanic symbol on the poster. He hated pretense and never drank. For Chuck Schuldiner, death was not the end but the beginning of profound contemplation of one's life, one's loss and one's identity, the lovely contradiction of the metal world. A musician whose music spoke volumes about him, he didn't have to shout his way to stardom or cause scandal to be remembered. What then transformed a timid Florida youngster into the unstoppable emblem of death metal? How come Chuck Schuldiner is still talked about as a legendary figure, even after more than 20 years have passed since his death? Watch this video to discover out childhood and teenage years. Long Island, New York is the birthplace of Chuck Schuldiner, who was born on May 13, 1967, to parents of Jewish, Spanish and Austrian ancestry. Chuck, the youngest of 3 siblings, came from humble beginnings but a loving family. His family relocated to Florida in 1968, a year that would see the state emerge as death metal's musical incubator. In the midst of ordinary middle-class American life and peaceful streets, a delicate spirit was gradually taking form. One the world has yet to realize would redefine an entire genre of music. Chuck was an introvert even as a little boy. He was an outcast at school, hated boisterous games and sought out quiet time alone frequently. As far as his teachers were concerned, little Schuldiner was no different from any other normal student. Chuck nevertheless was always unique to his loved ones. His peculiar preoccupations included music, existence and mortality. At the tender age of 16, Chuck experienced a watershed moment. A horrible motorbike accident claimed his brother Frank's life. There was an unseen scar on Chuck's soul from that loss. It would never completely heal, and he would never be the same. The idea of death had become concrete. It turned into a significant question that needed a solution, and something that tormented him every day but not in a morbid way. We exist for what reason? What is the true meaning of death? Chuck was given a guitar by his parents to help him deal with the pain that followed Frank's death. They were unaware that this present would end up being his salvation, the one friend who could comprehend the tempest within their youngest kid. Chuck didn't go to music school or take any lessons. He learnt nearly all he knows by ear. Intense, emotional, philosophical and profoundly human, this musical style began to take shape as a result of this primal desire and silent suffering. Chuck would never bury his disdain for education. He left high school before finishing, going against the grain of societal norms in order to follow his heart's desire. He learned the most about himself, about humanity, and about sorrow via music, and he believed that education should be about understanding, not about conforming. Although Chuck Schuldiner's upbringing wasn't sad per such, he was unique in that he experienced early death awareness, isolation, and silent grief. This was the youth of a person who didn't quite fit in with society, but who also wasn't prepared to rebel against it just yet. An itinerant spirit whose solace came from the music he composed himself. Start of one's professional life. In 1983, when Chuck Schuldiner was 16 years old, he formed the band Mantis in Florida with 2 pals, Rick Ross guitar and Cam Lee drums vocals. Not only were they a group of teenagers playing garage music, but they were also the progenitors of the death metal subgenre. Began writing rapid, heavy, death-laden songs in a cramped bedroom with homemade recording gear. Nonetheless, they maintained a distinct structural mentality, steering clear of the chaotic tendencies seen in many extreme bands of the day. Infernal Death 1984, Reign of Terror, and Death by Metal were among Chuck's self-recorded demos issued with Mantis. These cassettes were highly sought-after artifacts in the underground culture. Even if death metal hadn't been coined yet, Chuck's music had already beyond speed metal, transcended thrash, and dove into an unparalleled depth of evil. By 1984, Mantis had changed their name to Death, a moniker that well reflected the dreadful music they were doing. Concurrently, disagreements within the group surfaced. After Rick Ross, Cam Lee also quit the band. Chuck decided to continue on his own. At that point, Death stopped being a typical band. Chuck Schuldiner came up with the idea on his own, a solo adventure where the genius of a single mind was responsible for every note, chord, and concept. As Death's lineup was fine-tuned in 1985 and 1986, Chuck relocated around a lot. Before relocating to California to join Possessed, he performed with Slaughter in Canada, but he went back to Florida in the end to finish his own quest. He met drummer Chris Reifert there, and the two of them started working on Death's first album. Scream Bloody Gore was released by Death in 1987, their debut studio album, generally considered a linchpin of contemporary death metal. Despite working under severe time constraints, Chuck composed and performed virtually all of the instruments on the album. The result, though, was shocking. The release of Scream Bloody Gore ushered in a new era in music, one that was darker, more radical and fearless in its treatment of taboo issues: merchandise, decomposition, human frailty, and mortality. Not only did the album have a stunning sound, it also made everyone in the metal scene pay attention. A young Floridian without showmanship, major label support, or gimmicks had accomplished more than most heritage bands could have imagined. It was then that Chuck Schuldiner set off on an unstoppable course that would bring him to the forefront of a new genre, while simultaneously subjecting himself to its demands, loneliness, and self-doubt, because his uniqueness was a result of his own decisions. Achieving professional success, there was never an audience for Chuck Schuldiner's music. He has a clear goal in mind ever since the 1987 release of Scream Bloody Gore. Expression, not fame, was the goal. His brother's death had left him with unanswered questions, anger and anguish. Music helped him manage all of these emotions, recorded almost entirely by Chuck himself. That debut album not only shook up the metal world with its heavy sound and raw, effective structure, but it also established a genre that didn't even exist yet: black metal. Still, Chuck wasn't done yet. Death wasn't a one-hit wonder, as his 1988 album Leprosy demonstrated. The tempo increased, the guitar riffs became tighter, and the lyrics became more deliberate. Chuck has started using it as a platform to make social criticism in his music. He discussed the right to death and life support in his book Pull the Plug. Genocide and human indifference were themes he explored in Born Dead. Spiritual healing was controversial when it first appeared in 1990. Topics such as religious abuse, abortion, and profit-driven preaching were boldly addressed by Chuck. Some fans who were more into the gore and blood aesthetic of the era's metal were critical of him, but Chuck showed no fear. According to his interviews, Chuck's 1991 album Human was a watershed point in death metal history, receiving rave reviews from both reviewers and fans. The lineup underwent a radical transformation when Cynic's Sean Reinert drums and Paul Masvidal guitar joined the band. Rapid transitions from harsh riffs to abstract harmonies, unusual time signatures, and expert skill all contributed to the music's growing complexity and cerebrality. The lyrics become more contemplative and personal. The genre has evolved beyond death metal. It sounded like philosophy. In 1993, the subject of individual thought patterns was further explored in depth. Chuck started to doubt individual liberty, intellectual independence, and social control while performing with fretless bassmaster Steve DiGiorgio and powerful drummer Gene Hoglan. The record was a statement of defiance, not in defiance of authority, but in defiance of ideas. Not only did the music have people bopping, but it also got them to stop and consider. Chuck did Symbolic in 1995, an album that many Death fans regarded as their favorite by the band. At this point, the song's technical aspects were perfect, its lyrics were deeply moving, and its message went beyond the realm of extreme metal. It seemed as if Chuck was attempting to find a way to balance despair with optimism in songs like Perennial Quest, Crystal Mountain, and Empty Words, which sounded like chapters in a spiritual journal. As is unusual for extreme metal albums, Symbolic received positive reviews from metalheads and even made it into features in mainstream music magazines. However, Chuck had more to say. The Sound of Perseverance, Death's last album, and an unambiguous declaration on life and death, was released in 1998. At its most bizarre, the music swung between classical passages and the anguished scream of a person struggling to catch their breath. A lot of people were astonished by how silent the instrumental song Voice of the Soul was. A dying breath, a serene interlude from a man who knew his time was limited, it stood as a somber respite in an otherwise shattering record. Control Denied was Chuck's next project, which he unveiled shortly after. He aimed to produce melodic, clean vocal metal while keeping the intricacy and depth of his previous work. Its sole release to date was 1999's The Fragile Art of Existence. Chuck was diagnosed with a dangerous brain tumor, while his followers eagerly anticipated the sequel. Chuck, who never sought popularity, was imprisoned and had to battle for his life just as the metal community started to acknowledge him as a legend. Still, he refused to let his music slack off until the very end. We will not hurry releases, cut corners, or follow fads. It is for this reason that Chuck Schuldiner was not only a success but an enduring figure. Someone who is highly regarded by both fans and reviewers, as well as fellow artists. An individual may assume that Chuck Schuldiner was a sinister, violent, and merciless person based on the name of his band, Death. Whoever met him, though, stated just the opposite. In the metal community, Chuck stood out as one of the most kind, modest, and sympathetic individuals you could meet. He and his family, Mother Jane Schuldiner and Sister Bethann, lived in a little house in Florida for the most of his life. As far as Chuck was concerned, nothing could ever replace his family. He expressed profound appreciation for his mother in each of the dozens of interviews he gave, but he hardly spoke about himself. Rather than treating him like a rock star, Jane treated him like her youngest son, who had never really left her embrace, and she took excellent care of him right up to the death. Chuck never tied the knot, but in his twilight years he discovered serenity in the company of a lady who shared his sister's name, Bethany. She wasn't a renowned model or actress, but she became his rock when he was fighting a terrible cancer diagnosis. When his health, music, and future started to crumble, she was one of 3 people, along with his mother and sister, who stuck by his side. Chuck stood out in the metal community for his sobriety, drug abstinence, and lack of crazy partying. People were second to his affection for animals. At one time he contemplated abandoning music to pursue a career in veterinary medicine. He saved, fed, and cared for a large number of stray cats. In several interviews he revealed that he would have founded an animal sanctuary if he hadn't become a musician. This would have provided a sanctuary for vulnerable animals, similar to the one he wished for following the loss of his brother. Things that Chuck did not appreciate were being the center of attention and noisy. He remained away from controversies, never put on an act, and avoided the media. His friends remembered him as reliable, quirky, and full of life. Unbelievably generous with his time and attention, he responded to fans' personal messages, struck up conversations after performances, and never put himself above anyone. Respect for life, confrontation with hypocrisy, and defense of personal freedom were all songs that mirrored his life philosophy. A pessimist he was not. Contrarily, he knew the importance of life so well that he wrote about death. Even though he knew he was in agony, he refused to give in to it. What set Chuck apart was his paradox: placidity amid ferocity, quietness amid screams. Chuck Schuldiner opted for a life of extreme austerity, choosing not to own a home, expensive automobiles, or a pool. He altered the trajectory of an entire genre from the confines of his modest Florida home studio, where he worked in relative silence. After the cameras stopped rolling, he went on with his life as usual, unnoticed by anyone. Tragic illness and final days in late 1999, while Control Denied were getting ready to record their second album, Chuck Schuldiner started to get terrible headaches. He brushed them off as stress or overwork at first, but a sad prognosis came back from the doctors when he underwent testing. An exceedingly uncommon and deadly brain cancer called pontine glioma, from which there is almost little hope of survival. Chuck faced an adversary he couldn't vanquish with music at the age of 32, with so much unfinished business. On December 13, 1999, he underwent his first surgical procedure, just 2 years and 1 day before he passed away. Despite the physician's success in temporarily removing the tumor, he had to put his musical pursuits on hold due to the lengthy and painful recuperation process. The astronomical expense of Chuck's care quickly put his family in a precarious financial position. Because they did not have health insurance, they had to liquidate their possessions, take out loans, and ask for assistance. Despite this, the metal community throughout the world reacted with extraordinary kindness during this difficult hour. In remembrance of Chuck, hundreds of musicians, fans and artists coordinated fundraising events and benefit performances. All throughout the globe, Chuck charity concerts took place. The guy they hailed as a living legend was supported monetarily, emotionally, and spiritually by everyone from Testament to Cannibal Corpse to Napalm Death, and even Ozzy Osbourne. Chuck persisted with his treatment, even though it was quite difficult. He kept composing songs, played guitar when he could, and hoped for a comeback. His messages to followers were filled with hope and expressions of thanks. There was absolutely zero bitterness and zero words of self-pity. The tumor reappeared in late 2001. Far more malignant than before, as he had previously stated. Never able to eat normally, Chuck spent a lot of time in the hospital due to his chronic discomfort. But his loved ones, his mom, sister and girlfriend, were by his side the whole time. Chuck was adamant about not dying in a grave. He longed to return to his birthplace. The place he had composed music, experienced profound love, and lived his life to the fullest. At his Florida home, Chuck Schuldiner exhaled his last breath on December 13, 2001, exactly 2 years after his initial operation. In the embrace of his loved ones, he slipped away, unaccompanied by pomp and circumstance. Still, there was an outpouring of grief and tributes upon hearing of his passing. The identical reality was reflected by millions of letters and memorials throughout the United States, Europe and South America, as well as by thousands of publications. An irreplaceable spirit has been snatched from this planet. Neither did Chuck Schuldiner's demise bring him to a state of despair. Quietly, bravely, and with great humanity, he departed this world just as he had entered it. Enduring impact and legacy. There is no great media campaign honoring Chuck Schuldiner's legacy, no museum bearing his name, and no enormous fortune that he left behind. Yet what he did leave behind was something far more lasting, a legacy of creativity, spirituality, and humanity that millions of extreme music lovers all across the globe will never forget. Death, the band he co-founded and personified, must be the starting point for any discussion about legacy. Death didn't only exist, it changed continuously throughout its 14 years of action, from 1987 to 2001. Death broke all rules, going from simple rudimentary recordings, to complex, technically demanding works brimming with metaphysical profundity. Instead of making a template, Chuck Schuldiner destroyed all of them, and that's the reason why every death record is unique. With each stage came a new level of development, a benchmark that several bands have since attempted to match, but very few have managed to achieve. Today, Chuck's impact is recognized as irreplaceable by a wide range of musical groups, including technical death metal giants like Obscura, Nile, Gojira, and Beyond Creation, progressive bands like Opeth and Between the Buried and Me, and even black metal and avant-garde performers like Enslaved Eason and Devin Townsend. Through his music and his introspective approach to thinking about the nature of reality, society, and the purpose of life, he left an indelible mark. Chuck Schuldiner was an innovator in many ways when it came to the technical aspects of current metal guitar, using intricate key modulations, layered riffs, and chord progressions that lack conventionality. He created a narrative journey out of each song by fusing classical melody with thrash speed, using solos as expressions of emotion rather than displays of ego, and rejecting the conventional verse-chorus frameworks. The way he lived and created, rather than his method, may be his greatest legacy. That was proven by Chuck. You don't have to be emotionally intense to create extreme music. It is possible to maintain inner peace, even while surrounded by a chaotic environment. Even if you write about death, your love for life will remain unmatched. For those who love him, Chuck Schuldiner will always be an unmovable icon. An annual memorial page is set up, festivals are held in his honor, a t-shirt bearing the mantra, "Let the metal flow," a solo by Crystal Mountain, or "The Sound of Endurance" is uploaded online, and so on. Every one of them is like a little candle that keeps his soul alive. Metal Hammer, Guitar World, Loudwire, and Revolver are among the major publications that consider Chuck to be one of the most significant metal artists of all time. On the 20th anniversary of his passing in 2021, even non-metal bands paid homage, understanding that Chuck was more than simply a member of a musical genre. A part of him belonged to the absolute reality of art. Contrary to popular belief, Chuck Schuldiner was never one to follow the herd. The market was never an excuse for him to give in. That is why his music will always be relevant. It will never go out of style, be easy to replicate, or be forgotten. Becoming a legend was never Chuck Schuldiner's goal. All he was a guy who loved music and was faithful to his feelings no matter what, an enduring commitment to living an authentic life, regardless of the mayhem that engulfed him. He lacked charisma, charismatic words, and a movie star appearance. However, Chuck broke new ground in metal history, with nothing more than a guitar, passion, and soul, redefining the genre in ways that transcended mere technique. He transformed music into an introspective voyage, one in which contemplation of death replaced dread, where the destructive power of anger was transformed into a creative force, and where the extreme metal subgenre learned to listen instead of yell. Even though he only lived for 34 years, his legacy lives on in every album, song, and lyric that pays tribute to a man who refused to give in, compromise, or be forgotten. Chuck Schuldiner exemplified the uncommon qualities of an artist. He was honest, kind, and brave enough to forge his own way without a guide. He was also the founder of death metal. Perhaps Chuck was immortalized not by death per se, but by the manner in which he confronted it with music, faith, and silence. Chuck demonstrated that in a society where everything is noisy and quickly replaceable, there is no need to resist or yell in order to be remembered. Being completely authentic in all that you do is all that is required. Is Chuck Schuldiner's amazing and unfaltering path something you can relate to? Out of all his songs, which one resonated with you the most? Leave a comment with your ideas, and remember to subscribe and like if you want to continue reading about immortal tales. I appreciate you tuning in. Until the next video, take care.